Hi again, everybody. Let's take a look at the handout entitled Principles of Species Counterpoint in Tonal Music. Now, this topic is intended to kind of piggyback on first species, what we learned previously. And it's going to be, what we're going to talk about here is something very, very important that's going to sort of act as a framework for a lot of our understanding of harmony in common practice tonal music. We're going to take some of what we learned about first species and we're going to see if we can apply it to actual musical examples and if we can detect some of the relevance of this. Now, what we're going to do is, as the directions state, we're going to reduce the music. We're going to essentially reduce the outer voices to a note against note texture, so basically first species. In general, dissonances should be reduced out. Later on, a couple of them, for a couple of these examples, I'll tell you to include some dissonances. And then two, you're going to describe how the principles of species counterpoint are reflected in the music. So what should you be looking for here? Things to consider. Outer voice intervals, particularly the treatment of consonants and dissonance. How does it compare to what you learned in first species? Two, looking at the bass as a line and the melody, upper voice, as a line, do they conform to your knowledge of melodic guidelines? And then three, types of motion between the outer voice. What type of motion is used? How does this relate to first species? And I'm also going to show you some answers in a little bit. Okay, let's start with this first, and I'm going to go ahead and play you a recording of this. And so you'll want to have some staff paper with you here. So I'll play this for you and then I'll tell you to pause the video while you try this out on your own. Then I'll discuss what I would do. Let's hear that again. That was a little low. Okay, go ahead and pause the video and then I'll be moving on to my reduction of this. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at what I have here. This will be our sort of guideline for what most of these are going to look like. This first one's very, very easy to reduce. You're going to, all I did here was simply take the bass notes and the soprano notes because each one of these is going to be a note of the chord. Basically, I've included one soprano pitch for every chord and one bass pitch for every chord. That's kind of how you're going to usually approach this. All right, so what should I say about this one? What are some things that you might look at? First off, regarding intervals, we'll notice that, just like we learned in first species, mostly imperfect consonances, so sixes and threes. We tend to use octaves and fifths for the beginnings and endings where things will be more stable and static. And also, anytime we do have an octave in a different situation, notice how I always approach it by contrary motion. That's going to be another thing I'll mention in a little bit. But for one thing, you'll notice that only consonant intervals are used, and in particular, mostly imperfect consonants is in the middle, and perfect consonants is at the end. Very similar to first species. All right, now next up, next thing I would probably want to think about would be the individual lines. So if you look at the soprano part, you'll notice that that's essentially very similar to like a cantus firmus. It's very, very stepwise. It moves, also kind of reverses direction in a couple spots. There's really, in fact, this is almost entirely stepwise, except this one leap of a third at the very ending. So, and it has a little bit of an arch contour. Of course, this is not a full melody, it's just two measures. Now, but also the bass. Now, even though we're going to expect a little more leaping around in basses in actual music than in first species, you'll find out that, the bass, moving by step, look at the leap. You leap down and then you fill in the leap by moving in contrary motion to where the leap went. So down, then you fill in the leap. So you have that kind of gap fill thing happening here. Then it happens again right here. You leap down the fifth, and then you fill in. So the bass by itself also has a nice melodic contour. Now, lastly would be the types of motion. And I hinted at this already. The types of motion between the voices, mostly contrary. Now, there's a couple parallels. There's parallel sixths, parallel thirds. Those are, of course, allowed in species counterpoint, but no parallel fifths and no parallel octaves. But we have a lot of contrary motion. This is contrary motion. Here we have contrary motion. Here we have contrary. And here we have contrary. And as I mentioned, it's really important to have that contrary motion anytime that you're going into a perfect interval. All right, so there we go. That's the first example. Now, let me move us on to our next example. So keep that. Now, this next one's kind of interesting. It's going to be a little more elaborate. You're going to have to do a little more reducing out. But one thing to think about is, does this have anything to do with this? Does this new example by Schubert have any relationship to the Beethoven example we just looked at? All right, so let me play you a recording of this. Okay, go ahead and pause the video and I'll show you my result. Okay, let's take a look at my solution. Now, one thing I was going to think you would notice that this one, so this is actual musical example, had some suspensions that you needed to reduce out of the texture. So again, you're going to reduce out the dissonances and just kind of reduce it down to the framework. Now look at this and look at the first few measures of this Schubert. It's actually the exact same outer voice framework, just in a different key. This is in A flat major, this is in C major. So we're getting the exact same thing. I also forgot to mention in the earlier one, this voice exchange that occurs here. Same thing happens here, A flat and C, C to A flat, we get a voice exchange. So be on the lookout out for that as well. And then next, so all of the comments we talked about earlier apply here. It's just that the actual music disguised this framework by having some suspensions along the way. Second phrase, same kind of idea. Some other comments I would make about this one. Notice the gap fill on the bass. You leap up, then you step down, leap down, then you step up. We have that kind of gap fill thing happening. In the soprano too, we have this leap up here that then gets kind of filled in. So both of the lines are very good. Same kind of thing with the intervals. We have one octave, but it's approached by contrary motion. And we get also two voice exchanges here. As we're going to find out later in this course, voice exchanges tend to be indications of a prolongation of a harmony. So it's actually very interesting that this example is so similar to the Beethoven, but shows you the idea of embellishment, embellishing a basic framework. All right, now let's go on. Each one of these is going to get a little more challenging. Let's go on now to the next example. Sorry, here it is. Now for this one, you're gonna have to be thinking a little bit about reducing things out quite a bit more. Notice that the accompaniment here is much more of arpeggiations and things like that. Try to think about what the true bass line is to begin with. And then in the soprano, we got lots of little embellishments, like we got neighbor notes, we got consonant skips. Think about what the real soprano is in all these cases. Now in this reduction, you may also be able to include a couple passing tones if you want to, but that's up to you. My reduction is going to include a couple passing tones, but you don't need to do that. So let me go ahead and play this for you. I'm going to fast forward a little bit. Here we go. Okay, really short example. Go ahead and pause your video and try this one out. All right, let's take a look at my reduction. first look at my bass line. If you were doing a harmonic analysis, you'd see that essentially this is that's essentially a 1, 2, 5, 6, 5 to 1 progression. So those are the basic chords. Your basic bass line is just do, re, ti, do. And I did include this little passing tone here just to show you that it's a very simple bass line, but even this simple leap of a third is filled in the actual music with a passing tone. And then kind of same deal with the soprano. These are the main notes that were being embellished by those passing tones and neighbor note figures. And there was also one little passing tone you could put there. Now for this one, outer voices, if we look at the intervals, it's all imperfect consonances, right? Then if we take a look at the melodic lines, again, we already kind of mentioned this, stepwise motion, then you fill in the third here. It all conforms to melodic guidelines. And then finally, mostly contrary motion. So, well, this one's parallel motion, but then we have contrary right here and contrary right there. Again, the whole idea of contrary motion is to give the music more melodic independence. If you have the outer voices moving in contrary motion, then that allows you to hear them as separate streams. All right, so now this one, again, the result of this was very, very simple, but the reduction process of this took a little more thought. All right, let's now go on to the last one. And for this one, oops, sorry, let me pick that up in a second. Now for this Mozart Piano Concerto, let's just look at the first 4 measures. We could continue and do the rest of it, but I think the first 4 measures will be interesting enough. You're gonna have a little more trouble here. Try to follow the main line. One thing I'll tell you is follow the line that starts with C sharp in the soprano. The bass is fairly straightforward, but follow where that voice goes from chord to chord. See if you can sketch something out. You will have to kind of ignore some upper voices along the way. Let me play you this example. Okay, go ahead and try this out. In this one, you're going to encounter some dissonance. So that's one thing I want to be pointing out about this one. You're going to find some divergences from first species, and we're going to start to think a little bit about what the significance of those divergences are. So go ahead and pause the video now. Okay, once you've had some time to work on this, let's go ahead and take a look at my solution for this. Now, you probably have some different interpretations here, but this is what I have. Let me first start by before I get into the details about why I chose these voices and what's going on with these dissonances that I've circled, just look at the melodic lines. This is clearly an example of nice stepwise lines. This just kind of moves down from scale degree 5 by step all the way to scale degree 7. Whereas the bass has a little neighbor note figure, and then you have the leap down and the step up, so you're filling in the leap. So one thing you see here is the outer voices acting very melodically. Now what I want to talk about, also we do have lots of contrary motion, but I'm mostly interested in talking about these dissonances. Remember, in first species, you're not allowed to use fourths. Those are considered dissonance. Diminished fifths, those are also considered dissonances. So we have 3 dissonances that seem to be happening with the outer voices. What might this be telling us about the music? First off, this dissonance right here, it tells you a couple of things. One is it tells you that actually this F sharp in the bass is a dissonance, that it's actually somewhat of a suspension. Now, it's actually what we call a 2-3 suspension. You can't tell that from the voices I have here, but if you looked at the upper voice, you'd see that there's a 2-3 suspension happening in the bass in this measure. So that's one thing to think about. That means that, and ultimately, if we think about this measure, this note is kind of something that should get reduced out at a deeper level of structure. In some sense, this note is so dissonant that it kind of belongs back here, and the true bass note of this measure is the E sharp. However, even if that's the case, we have this dissonant diminished fifth here. As we're going to find out, dissonances, that means they're going to ultimately be examples of what we call later prolongations, oftentimes prolongations of the tonic. And here, I can kind of see that the soprano note is creating a passing tone between notes of the tonic triad. So that passing motion gives you a little sense of the function of this. And also in the bass, like I mentioned earlier, there's a neighbor note. So we kind of have various things that are embellishing the tonic chord. And you can tell that by the outer voices. The intervals really matter quite a bit here. So we kind of get the passing tone here, and we get the neighbor note in the bass. Now, lastly, we also get a dissonance right here. Now, you can reduce that out, but it's very strongly emphasized in the actual music. This chord, by the way, is what we're going to later call the cadential 6/4. And we're going to learn that that's essentially going to be a prolongation or an embellishment of the 5 chord. Therefore, this dissonance right there also helps hammer in the idea that that chord, or that note F sharp in the soprano, is an embellishment in some sense. Okay, so those are just some ideas to kind of get something in your head for later on. We'll come back to that, but essentially, the intervals that happen between the outer voices often have a lot of significance, particularly when they happen to be dissonances. Okay, so there we go.